Hello, everybody filing in. Just started a minute early, so you can all come and get yourself comfy, grab a coffee or a tea or a water, and settle in for Bianca's webinar. We'll start at about 1 minute past the hour, just to give people ample opportunity to come in and get settled. And while we're waiting, you can see a poll up on your screen. It'd be fantastic if you could fill that out. Gives us an understanding of the skills and requirements that you're hoping to be spoken about today. Hi to everyone coming through the door, the virtual door. We'll give it 1 more minute and then we'll get underway. Okay, we might get started, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Making Freelance Work, a journalist's guide to starting out. I'm John Bergen, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. It's the second in a 3-part series brought to you by the Walkley Foundation. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are joining from today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal country in the heart of Redland, Redfern, I should say, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. So look, freelancing offers a lot of independence, but it also asks a lot of journalists. You're not only finding and reporting stories, you're pitching, negotiating, managing your time and tracking your income, thinking about super and tax, and making decisions about what kind of working life is sustainable over the long term. And today's webinar is designed to give you a practical, honest look at that reality. We'll be looking at how freelance journalism works day to day. That's from turning ideas into pictures and approaching editors, to managing workflow, understanding fees, and navigating some of the business basics that sits behind independent journalism. And so to that end, we're very lucky to have Bianca Nogrady leading today's session. Bianca is an award-winning freelance science journalist and author, and across nearly 2 decades of freelance reporting, she has written for major Australian and international outlets and built a career that speaks directly to the realities, the opportunities and pressures of freelance work. And as always, we are keen to hear from you. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box as we go, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of today's webinar. And with that, I'll hand over to Bianca.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, John, and welcome everybody. I'm joining you from Darug and Gundungurra land in the Blue Mountains, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So as John said, I've been a science journalist since 2002 and a full-time freelancer since 2006. I write news and features regularly for Australian outlets like The Guardian, the Saturday Paper, international outlets including Nature, Medscape in the US, British Medical Journal, and I've also written for Wired, MIT Tech Review, had one glorious piece in the Atlantic, Australian Geographic, ABC, BBC, and others. As well as the journalism, I also do contract writing work for universities, research organisations and institutes. I do random things like filling in for Dr. Carl, doing writing for a museum exhibition, and I also do a lot of unpaid sort of volunteer stuff as well. Just sort of putting that in because it's important to kind of, I guess, show the diversity of what freelancing looks like. So I'm trying to get through a lot in a short amount of time. So apologies for going at warp speed, and I will try and make sure that we do have enough time for questions at the end. So first thing, what is it like being a full-time freelance journalist in Australia? The pros, I work pretty much entirely from home. which works for me. The work hours are incredibly flexible, which also works for me. I can say no to work that I really don't want to do, and that includes editors or publications that I don't want to work with, unless I'm really desperate for cash. There's always the caveat. My income is highly variable on a weekly, monthly kind of scale, but the annual average is pretty good. Over the past 10 years, my income's ranged from 100 to 140,000 a year. But I also want to stress that I've been doing this for over 20 years. I work in a reasonably specialist area, which is science, and then within that area, I cover pretty much everything: science, health, and environment. And I also mix journalism with content writing and other income. But also at the same time, I could do less volunteer stuff and earn more money. I could also probably be better at asking for more money. So, yeah, so take that all with a grain of salt. Another pro of freelancing, and this probably comes as a surprise to many people, is that my job is a lot more secure than in-house journalism jobs, particularly at the moment. Like I said, I've been doing this effectively full-time for 20 years, give or take a couple of books and a couple of babies. If I lose work with one publication, if they close down or an editor moves on, I still have others that I work with. I've got a diversity of outlets and sources of income. And if things get quiet, I just need to ask for more work, or I can pitch more to increase my income. Being freelance makes it easier to navigate family responsibilities. I also love that I have a diversity of outlets and editors and subject areas that I work with and on. And I also like the diversity of work that I do. I actually really enjoy a lot of the content writing work that I do, and I learn stuff because I'm a huge nerd, so that works for me. It's never dull. So those are the pros. The cons: huge variability in income month to month. Again, I've been charting this for quite a few years. I think the lowest I earned in a month was about $1,500, and this is before tax. This is including, and from this I have to pay super and a whole lot of other things. And then another month I was paid $22,000. So the amount of variation and money and timing of money coming in is one of the biggest challenges with freelancing, particularly if your expenses like mortgage payments or rent or whatever are fairly static. In Australia, it's actually really hard to make a full-time living exclusively from journalism. I know that there are people in the US that do that. It's pretty tough in Australia to do that. I don't really know anyone that just does freelance journalism and makes a full-time income. You need to have other irons in the fire, and that might be contract writing, teaching, editing, whatever it is. And that in turn can create conflicts of interest that you have to manage. As a freelancer, you are also managing a business. So you are doing the equivalent of Ginger Rogers to Fred Astaire. You're doing journalism, but you're doing it backwards and in high heels. You're also invoicing, you're doing admin, you're running a website, tax, super, managing relationships with editors. It's a lot. It is an additional workload that you have to factor in. As a freelancer, you get no paid sick leave, no holiday pay, no long service pay, no any kind of paid leave. And that sucks. It really sucks. Obviously, there's you have to pay your own superannuation, you have to pay your own insurance. So there are additional costs that are associated with freelancing that you have to factor in when you're deciding to choose this path. There are home office costs, but to be honest, they're not that expensive. It's electricity, internet, all the usual stuff, which most of us have anyway. Rejection is a part of freelancing that some people really struggle with, and it's not great for the ego when you have a story you think is an absolute banger and you get no response from a whole lot of editors. It's not great, but it is also part of the gig, and it is for in-house as well. I guess the advantage of getting rejected in-house is generally you get some feedback or it's done to your face, whereas as a freelancer you may just get radio silence. As a freelancer, outlets close and editors leave, and you can be left just with nothing, no explanation, and what might have been a really solid line of regular work can suddenly dry up with no explanation. It's really hard to take time off as a freelancer because you have to really try and balance all of your short-term and long-term deadlines and really carve out time when you do not use your computer and you do not work, and it's really, really hard to do. And it can be hard to say no as a freelancer. So, I've been in situations where I'm absolutely flat out, but then someone comes in with a commission. It's like, I can't say no to this. This is an amazing opportunity. And you just have to try and fit it in. Sometimes the word rate you get paid doesn't reflect the amount of work that actually goes into a piece. I've done sort of 600-700 word news stories that have been 17,000 words worth of interviews and huge amounts of back and forward editing, fact checking, and that is not really going to pay your way. So there's always a balance. There's the work that you love but doesn't pay well, and then there's the work that's day to day, but it pays the bills. It subsidizes the stuff you love, I guess. And also, generally, particularly in Australia, word rates are shit. You don't get annual increases unless you ask for them. And even when you do ask for them, it's like, no, sorry, contributor budgets are tight. So, as I'll explain later, a good proportion of my work is actually for international outlets. So, how much do I work as a freelancer? Again, this varies a lot week to week. I do charted my workload for quite a few years as well. And generally, I submit between 1 to 5 things a week. So that could be news, features, could be doing a workshop like this, it could be doing a radio spot, could be writing a 400-word press release. Some weeks are really busy. If I'm doing a lot of conference coverage, for example, I might have 7 or 8 news stories that I file in a week. Might have 2 features that both happen to fall on the same week, which also happens. But then I also occasionally have a week where I actually hand nothing in, like last week. But I also have, usually at most times, I have 5 to 10 things on my list of work. And those might be deadlines that range from 48 hours to 6 months, which is pretty much exactly the situation I'm in right now. So it's really, really varied. The money stuff. So as I said, word rates vary enormously. In Australia, my word rates in Australia range from about 75 cents to about 90 cents a word. Those are for sort of mainstream Australian outlets. But overseas, it's more sort of $1.50. The highest I think I've ever earned was $2.25 a word, but that was paid in US rates. So yeah, higher rates definitely from US-based publications. Most places it's paid by word rate. Occasionally you'll get a sort of a flat rate, like a fixed word count. Like I do press releases for an Asian research news outlet, and that's just like £200 for 400 words. And that's also kind of straightforward. Another thing to consider with money is that you are paying your own superannuation. So take 12% of whatever you earn, that is your super, or you should be paying superannuation. I also have to pay workers' compensation insurance. I also have administrative costs, accounting fees, home office costs, travel costs in the rare occasions that I do actually travel for a story. It's pretty rare to get compensated for that these days. So generally about half to 3/4 of my income comes from overseas sources. And that includes The Guardian, which for reasons only known to The Guardian, pays everything out of the UK. And also Nature magazine, which is a big international science magazine. I write for a number of different nature offices, but it all kind of gets paid internationally. So that's the money stuff. And yeah, I'm sorry, because I'm looking at a Word doc, so I'm not checking on Zoom. So if there is anything urgent, John, please draw my attention to it. But save your questions because I'm going to rip through all of this. So getting started, how to set up a freelance business. It's actually pretty straightforward. Get an ABN. Yeah, that's not hard to do. I have this question, do you need to register a business name? If you are trading under your personal name and you're producing bylines, you don't need to. I think sort of people who work off more do editing work where their name is less obvious. Sometimes you might want to register a business name, but it's really not important. Big one is whether you're better off being a sole trader or a proprietary limited company. I think a lot of freelancers, most freelancers are sole traders. I set up a proprietary limited company for my first book because the contract required me to indemnify the publisher against litigation. And thankfully, my co-author's wife was a lawyer. And so she suggested setting up a company because that would limit my personal exposure to litigation, so that if someone wanted to sue me, they could only get access to the company's assets, not my personal assets. I believe, and I'm not a lawyer, that does offer some degree of protection. And so it's something that to maybe keep in mind if you are concerned about your assets being up for grabs in any kind of lawsuit. There are potentially tax-related advantages, and again, talk to an accountant. I'm not an accountant, but it does also make your tax return more complex. You have to pay an annual fee to ASIC. It's relatively easy to set up a proprietary limited company. So, but again, this is something to talk to an accountant about. Which is the next point is when you're setting up, make sure you have a good accountant. Particularly as a freelancer, if you're making this your business, a good accountant is worth their weight in gold in terms of working out what you can and can't claim and making sure that you are actually making the most of your income. Do you need to register for GST? Again, an accountant will give you advice on this. I think the GST threshold is 75,000 a year. I don't know if that's changed, but if you're earning more than that, you have to register for GST. If you register for GST, make sure that you collect it and pay it to the tax office. But you only charge GST of Australian clients, not international outlets. If you're earning under that, you can still register for it. And if you have a lot of business related expenses that have GST on them, it means you can then claim those back. So it's kind of a numbers game. I think if you're earning less than 75,000, it's a bit of a numbers game as to whether it's worth your while to do. Another really important piece of advice that I always give around freelancing is have a safety net, have some savings set aside. I usually say like 5,000, but I think I've had that figure for 20 years. So maybe kind of bump that up to 10,000 with Because He Lives these days. And I know that's a lot of money to have, but it's really important to have some kind of buffer zone because as I explained earlier, your income is highly variable, and it may be that the month that you only get 2,000 worth of invoices getting paid might be the month that your car breaks down or you get sick or something happens where you need that buffer zone. So, for some people that buffer zone might be a partner who's got a steady income. It might be parents who can, back you up if you need it. But if you haven't got anything like that, try and find some way to have at least $5,000 set aside just for those emergencies. And I've needed that, I've done that, and it is really, really important to do. Another fundamental thing you must do as a freelancer is to set up superannuation and pay into it regularly. I cannot stress how important this is. If you're a sole trader, you are not obliged by law to pay yourself superannuation. As a proprietary limited company, you are, because I'm the employee of my company. The reason that it's important because a lot of freelancers, particularly when things are tough, won't pay super, and then there is this risk that then you get to later in life and you don't have enough superannuation, and it's a huge risk. So I know it seems, particularly if you're younger and you're starting out in this, you think, well, why would I want to park this money for when I'm 65? But I think it's a particular disadvantage in the gig economy that so many people working in this way don't set up and don't set aside enough for their retirement. So the way I approach this is every payment that comes in to my account, I set 50% aside into a separate account. And so it's easy, if I get paid $2,000, I put $1,000 in the other account. And it means that at every quarter, I've got plenty there to pay my quarterly BAS, pay-as-you-go superannuation. Means when end of year tax time comes, I've got enough money to cover it. And it is also a buffer zone for emergencies, although I try not to use it because then you've got to make sure you fill it back up again. But yeah, pay your super. I can't stress that enough because employers do not. They should, but they don't. It's worth setting up a website because that's your shop front, that's your portfolio. It's pretty easy to do. I don't think I need to go into how to do that. But yeah, it's really a way that people can find you, and people have found me through my website. I've had work through my web. I've had work come to me through LinkedIn as well, so that's also worth having. I know LinkedIn is not the greatest, but it's certainly worth being on there and posting regularly. Put your stuff online that you've written. Do you need insurance? Workers' compensation insurance, if you're a sole trader, I don't believe you do, but if you're a company and you pay yourself as a worker, which I do, you're required by law to have it. So that's a cost for being a freelancer. Personal indemnity and public liability insurance is an interesting one. I've had contracts where they actually require me to have those as the contract. And in the past, I've said, get knotted. I'm not paying $1,000 a year for insurance for this 300-word story that you're commissioning for me. And often that works. I've never really thought of it in terms of it actually being a useful product to have, but because I'm not generally writing in an area that's likely to get me sued, never say that, touch wood. But that said, MIA Freelance Pro membership does include personal indemnity and public liability insurance. So I don't really know. Some people have it, some people don't. Income protection insurance, I think, again, I don't have it. I think it can be tricky for freelancers to get because your income is so varied and unpredictable. So the last hot tip for getting started is join Copyright Agency Limited. And I cannot explain to you what CAL does. It is this miraculous and wondrous institution. I don't know how it works, but periodically I get money from them because somebody has copied something that I have written, or photocopy, like reproduced something that I've written, and that has been documented. And by mysterious and magical means, CAL does these regular surveys. And if they pick up your byline in something, for example, say there's a company newsletter that they've reproduced one of your articles in, CAL gives you money. Also, CAL is a fantastic resource for understanding copyright, but it's free to join, and essentially it just means that they look for your byline. Doesn't mean they pick up everything, and I don't know how their surveys work, but I've had payments of $1,000 that just kind of come through, and it's, yeah, everyone gets very excited around CAL payment times, so it's a good one to do. Okay, so the next thing is when you're setting up your business, a really important question to work out, or thing to ask yourself, is what is your niche? Like, how are you actually going to define yourself as a freelance journalist? The first question is, what do you want to write about? So, I mean, this is really important because I think particularly if you're starting out in your career, you might not necessarily know this. You might have just come out of uni or fairly new to this. And as I was when I started out, it's like, well, I don't know, I just want to do journalism. But having a niche really helps because it allows you to specialize, it allows you to stand out from the crowd, and it just makes it more interesting. So the first question is, well, what are you interested in? And that might be, like in my case, big nerd, science, always loved science. So science, health and environment, that is what I have always been interested in. That's what got me into this profession. But it's also, what are your areas of expertise? And so some of you may actually not even be working in journalism at the moment. You might be a scientist, you might be a lawyer. That is your expertise, and that doesn't necessarily pigeonhole you and mean that you have to work in that space, but it helps particularly when you're starting out, because it means that you know that field, you know the experts, you know the publications, you've got an advantage in that field that someone else doesn't have. And you can be very broad within that. Like I said, my niche is science, but within that I cover all of science, all of health and medicine, all of the environment. I draw the line at quantum because it just makes my brain curdle, although I have still occasionally written something quantum-y. Another question to ask yourself is, well, where do you have good contacts? And this can be not just expert contacts in terms of the area that you want to write about, but also publishing contacts. So, for example, when I went freelance, I had been working as a medical reporter at Australian Doctor, which is a GP magazine. So when I left there, I got in touch with these various medical organisations. So, for example, the Royal College of Pathologists at the time produced this really glossy members magazine. And I just contacted them and said, hey, I was at AusDoc. I used to, interact with you. So you produce this magazine. Do you use freelancers? And it turned out that they did. And so that was one of the first gigs that I got when I left. So if you do go into freelancing from a profession, think about the kind of publications, the industry publications in your profession that you might have read, or maybe they just got delivered to you and you ignored them, or they came in your email and you ignored them. But those publications may use freelancers. And so that can be a nice starting point to get into and to start to build up your experience. Also, within that sector, you've got contacts. You know who the people are. You know what the organisations are to go to for comment, for interviews, and that's also a real advantage. The next question to ask yourself in defining your niche is, what sort of publications do you want to write for? So when I sort of first went freelance, it's like, I want to write for newspapers because that was the big sexy thing because I'm that old. And look, newspapers are also still attractive. They're very high profile. It's a general public, so it's a big audience, wide range of potential topics, lots of different sections of the publication that you can write for. The downsides with newspapers is that there's increasingly fewer opportunities for freelancers. Their contributor budgets are being cut. They're also, getting rid of in-house staff. So I don't quite know where they think they're going to get content from, probably AI, but they're not always the best word rates. They're really negotiable. It's a tough nut to crack. And even when you do crack it, it's not necessarily the best business option, which is not to say don't do it. Obviously I write for the Saturday paper, I write for the Guardian, but it is a harder sector to really get a foot in the door. Particularly, the editors are great. If you can find a good relationship with a good editor, that's worth its weight in gold. Maybe you're more interested in sort of magazines, online print magazines, and those are great as well. And they tend to have a much higher proportion of content that's from freelancers. Great exposure, decent word rates, well, mostly better word rates. Also, what I love about kind of magazines, and I use that very broadly to include pure web-based stuff, is that there's so much diversity in this area. Just in the science field alone, there's just extraordinary range of publications that I could pitch to. And some of these are folded, so it's been a while, but there's magazines that are specifically about birds or about autism or about coastal science and society, or about the interaction between science and culture. So there's such a long tail of specialist interests, and that's brilliant if you've got a story you think, what, this would be perfect for that niche interest. So magazines are great. Sometimes they have shitty contracts as well. They used to. I don't know how much that's still the case. So another area to think about, which is sort of, I guess, under the magazines one, is looking at the business to business specialist industry magazine sector. So in my line, that's all the medical publications, like the British Medical Journal and the Lancet, Nature. It can be industry publications, dental magazines, pharmacy news, those sorts of things. So it is still journalism. It's just writing for a much more specialist niche audience. Sometimes these publications are actually produced by the associations, like the British Medical Journal is published by the British Medical Association. Sometimes they're published by custom publishing houses. So the one I used to do a lot of work for was called Cortext in Melbourne, but they're all over the place. Nature, for example, the big science magazine, has a huge custom publishing division that just produces content for universities, for whatever. Again, there's a lot of work in this space for freelancers. The rates can be reasonably good, can be reasonably regular work. So for example, the Royal College of Pathologists magazine that I mentioned, I wrote for them for quite a long time. They were really interesting stories and, reasonably good rates as well. Sometimes it's a bit less sexy and high profile, but if mining is your thing, then find the mining industry magazines and go for it. So another area you might think about working is content writing. So this is not journalism. This is content. You are essentially generating something for an organization, for an industry that is, I guess, they have a particular message they want to get across. And I think it's important to specify this because it is a proportion of my income. I'd say maybe a third to a half, it varies, of my income would probably be kind of content writing. It does vary a lot. And I actually really enjoy it. I like it because I learn stuff. I get story ideas, but obviously you have to manage that very carefully around conflicts of interest. So for me, it's things like university magazines, Monash Life, Western Sydney University's Future Makers. I used to write for the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation magazine, which was called Fish. And it was really fun. I learned stuff and it's generally good rates of pay. And, once you get that sort of gig, it's often regular work. And it can be things like case studies for annual reports, web content, press releases. It's a huge range of work that's out there. Obviously, it's not journalism. It's not bylined. It might not be the most exciting stuff. you can have a lot of back and forward with the client if if they have like 5 different people who are going to edit. So you have to actually manage your client and manage that relationship, and that takes more time as well. So those are different publications you can think about writing for. Another question to ask yourself is, what audiences do you want to write for? And again, this kind of ties in with the publications. Do you want to write for the general public? Do you want to write, the biggest audience, stories that are relevant for everyday people? And that's great. It is also the most competitive field because everybody generally wants to write for the biggest audiences. So also think about specialist audiences. So that, in my case, it might be doctors, it might be the mining industry, it might be retirees, it might be parents. Again, more specialized. It's a way to distinguish yourself a little bit, that you've kind of make the most of your niche. Can be highly technical, which, again, I love, particularly with the science stuff. I like being able to actually try and work out how to explain what the neurobiology of sickle cell anemia looks like. And if that's your jam, that's great. Another thing to really consider with freelancing, and I've sort of hinted about this, is Australian versus international in terms of audiences. I strongly recommend looking as much as possible at international publications. And this can work in a number of ways. Firstly, because you're in Australia, you are able to cover Australian issues for an international audience, and you might save them, the cost of sending someone out here to cover things, which obviously they don't often do, but you have a geographic advantage. And look, that really works. For example, when the bushfires, the 2019 bushfires were on, I'm in the Blue Mountains. And so that was when I was writing for The Atlantic and for USA Today, and I was in NPR because I was here on the ground. It was something that was deeply personal to me and my experience. And that was an advantage that few other people had. The other thing as well is that, I know we kind of think of ourselves as the kind of backwater of the world, but international news organizations are interested in what is happening in Australia, surprisingly so. I get a lot of, particularly at the moment, a lot of work. It's like they want to know what's happening with, for example, the vaping ban, or they want to know what's happening with, doctors' strikes. So always think, particularly if it's a story you've covered for an Australian outlet, sort of think, well, is there any international outlets that might also be interested in this? And of course, the pay is almost always much, much better, particularly when you're writing for the US. So the next question to ask is, what kind of articles do you want to write? News, quicker, easier, well, not easier, quicker turnaround, short deadlines. It's often more work. You might have a 400-word news story and you've got to interview 4 people for it. But if you get it regular and you get into the formula of it, it can be, I guess, easier to turn around fairly quickly. And it's also then a source of ideas and contacts for other longer features. Features, everyone loves writing features. It allows you to get much more into the subject matter. It's not so kind of tight deadline-y, but it is also more work. And another thing to also keep in mind as well, I remember an editor saying that, freelancers are always pitching news and features, but they forget about all the other parts of the magazine, like the profile section or the Q&A or opinion or analysis or commentary. So always, particularly with magazines, look at the different section. Is it reviews? Is it, I don't know, the funnies, whatever. Always look beyond just the news and features section and look for ways that you can pitch things, because those are often neglected sections of a publication. So the next thing is finding stories. Ideally, you want to, I think different freelancers might have different views on this. I like to be in a position where a good proportion, let's say 3/4 of the stories that I'm writing, are ones that have been assigned to me. I haven't had to pitch them. But then I also like having some flexibility in there to pitch, because I find stories, I have no shortage of them. They're everywhere. And so usually if I'm pitching something, it's because I really want to write about it. And when you start out, you'll need to find your own stories to pitch a lot more. And look, if you're already working in journalism, you'll kind of know this, but yeah, keep a file somewhere and just write down any story ideas that pop into your head. Like, my problem isn't having story ideas, it's having the time and the energy and the confidence to pitch them. When you are thinking of an idea, always also think in terms of audiences and outlets. So a story is nothing without an audience that's going to be interested in it, and therefore a publication that wants to get that story to them. Think about the angle and the news hook. It's not enough to sort of have an idea. It's like, I want to write about solar power. It's like, okay, so what's your angle? What actually makes this story unique? And what's the news hook to make this story relevant now? And also, why you? Why should you be the person to write this? And sometimes that doesn't matter, but sometimes it does matter that you are in this situation like me with the bushfires, for example. And with stories as well, think about a single story can appeal to multiple outlets in different ways. So, never waste a good pitch. Even if it gets over the line, if it doesn't get over the line, think of other outlets where they might be interested. So, for example, when Australia introduced a ban on engineered stone because all these young workers were getting silicosis, lung disease, pitched it to the BMJ, Australians banned this. They're like, great, wrote that up for them. But then I also pitched it to the LA Times because they were having huge issues with silicosis in the US for the same reason. Didn't get it over the line, but still, it's an illustration that always think in terms of multiple places, and what might be a straight, hard news story for one outlet could be a colour feature for another. And as always, think international with any idea. It's like, okay, this might be relevant for an Australian audience, but can I pivot this, or can I change this in some way that it might appeal to an international audience? Sources of stories, press releases. I generally hate press releases, but it's worth signing up to ones from companies, orgs, institutes, not-for-profits that are operating in the spaces that you're interested in. I'm a big fan of conferences, which is particularly relevant in the science field, but I think in any sector, if there's conferences that you can get along, get a media pass to, maybe try and get a letter of commission ahead, or sound out an editor and say, hey, look, I'm thinking of going to this. Would you be interested in some pitches? Conferences for me particularly are a fantastic source of stories. So it's things like the International AIDS Society conference in Brisbane recently. I mean, I get paid to cover those for a US outlet, but I'm also there with my radar out for any other stories for other outlets as well. I find personal experiences are an absolute goldmine of story ideas. One of my favorites is the tick bite leading to red meat allergy story, which I was one of the first journalists to write about back in, I think it was about 2008. And that came from a friend who had been bitten by a tick and developed red meat allergy. And I've exploited him mercilessly over the years to tell that story. Another thing is to also looking for story ideas is what's the bigger story or the second day story behind a news story that's happening. The news has been covered, it's in the mainstream, dailies, whatever, but what's the story behind the story? That can you dig into that and pitch that? It's also really good to check back on stories that you've covered and to see where they're at. Like there's stories that I've written about 15 years ago that I still keep track of. It's like a science discovery or something where it's like, that's really cool. And just, every now and then I just look up where they're at. And that can be really important in terms of, like court cases coming up or a verdict or something. So you just got to always have your radar out and put stuff in your diary. Like I have reminders of like, oh, contact this person and find out what's happening with that court case. And also with the interviews, sometimes interviewees will just mention something completely unrelated that you just go, what? Okay. Yeah, follow it up. And repurpose ideas as well, which I guess I keep saying is like you might have written a specific specialist story on, mining or environmental technology or energy tech or whatever. But always think about, well, can I pivot and pitch that to a consumer outlet, for example, or an international outlet? I also get newsletters from research organizations, all of those kind of sources. Senate inquiries, Senate estimates, all of those things are really worth keeping tabs on as well if they're relevant to your area. And again, I look for when the report is due from a Senate inquiry or parliamentary inquiry. I put it in my diary to follow up when the report's due out and see what's happening. FOI is an interesting one. I think there's some journalists who sort of make a living out of just kind of going fishing on FOI and seeing what comes up. It does take some specialist knowledge to navigate FOI. Freedom of Information. I should specify that. I'm not great at it. I've tried it a few times. I've never really managed to get something, but I'm probably not doing it right. But if that's something that you know how to do, that can be an interesting way of just having a fish around, seeing what comes up. Social media, funnily enough, can be a really interesting source of stories. And I've picked up a couple over the years. I know there's a journalist, Fiona Macmillan, who used to search back when Science Twitter, or when Twitter was still, not a cesspool, used to search Twitter for tweets containing our new study. So someone might say, hey, our new study is out. And she would, because they're excited. And so she would actually look and see what the study was and make a pitch out of it. So yeah, any source, like finding stories is not going to be your problem. Pitching them is I would say one of the harder parts of freelancing, because it's not like you can just pop next door to the editor's office and say, hey, I just had this conversation with so-and-so. I think there's a story here. What do you reckon? I should say I've never worked in-house at a daily, so I'm not kind of sure that that's what happens. So the thing with pitching is it isn't just about getting the commission. It's also, with a pitch, you are getting on an editor's or a publication's radar. So a rejection isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if you get a personalized rejection. And one of my career high points was getting a personalized rejection from the New Yorker. Like it's very special. One day I'll get over the line, but in the meantime, I've got that to hang on to. So think of it as knocking on the door. They're opening the door, you're showing what you've got. They may not buy it, but chances are they've taken a look at you and they've taken a look at what you're pitching. And even if it's not right for them at that moment, you are now still on the radar. The door is open. So for me, the fear with rejection isn't so much actually getting rejected, it's whether I can deliver on what I've promised. So make sure when you're pitching, you can actually deliver the story. Like, don't pitch an exclusive profile of so-and-so if you actually haven't lined up with so-and-so that they're open to being profiled. It's good practice to try and pitch regularly. If you're starting out, you're probably going to be pitching a lot because that might be your main source of income. I try and pitch at least once a month. I used to keep track of it, but I haven't done for a while. But even, once a fortnight. And, especially if it's sort of short turnaround stuff, if you see an idea, just smash out a pitch, see where it happens. The worst that'll happen is nothing. So don't overthink it with a pitch, especially if it's editors you already have a relationship with. The editors that I've worked with for a long time, it might just be one or two sentences like, hey, this just happened. Are you interested in a story? But don't talk yourself out of a pitch. Like, just, yeah, you particularly when you're pitching, for example, to international outlets as an Australian, you have a bigger advantage than you think you do. And you may have that story. You may have that story that just lands on an editor's desk and they just go, you know what? Yes. Which is why it's important to always pitch to the best possible relevant publication. Like, aim high, dream big. Even if you just go, oh my God, there's no way that they would take this, pitch it anyway. And there's a science freelancer, Gemma Conroy, who did a cold pitch to the New York Times and landed a story, which actually became this wonderful, wonderful story. So you never know. Always give it a go. In terms of what a pitch looks like, before we get into it, there's a great online database, or there's a few of them, but the Open Notebook is a science one, which includes a lot of mainstream publications. So it's, the pitches that have been successful, and then the article that resulted from them. So that's really good to just get a sense of what a good pitch looks like. And also follow editors that you're interested in pitching to on socials, because sometimes, and this used to be the case more with Twitter, but they might do pitch call outs, but you can also see what they're interested in, the stories that they share, and it'll give you a sense of what they want. So before you pitch a story, first check that they use freelancers. So usually there'll be like a submissions link somewhere, or Write for Us, might be at the bottom of the homepage, might be on the About Us or Contact Us page. If you don't see anything, just try anyway, but that helps if you can find the actual link to do it. Check they haven't run the story before. Don't pitch them a story that then you discover they actually ran pretty much that exact story a week ago. So use their search tool before you pitch. Think about whether your story is of interest to this publication. So there's no point pitching a story on body piercing to a magazine for retirees, or maybe there is, but it's an obscure one. So really get a sense of a publication before you pitch to make sure that that this is something that they will actually be interested in. And that also applies to their style. Like, don't pitch, a hard-hitting investigative piece to, I keep using a magazine for retirees because that's the only one I can think of. But yeah, make sure that you're actually pitching something that's in keeping with their style. Make sure it's in keeping with their length requirements. So if you've got a 2,000 word feature, don't pitch it to the news section. And likewise, don't pitch 100 word, a 200 word or 500 word short to somewhere that runs 5,000 word features. So publications often have freelance guidelines or pitching guidelines. Sometimes they can be a little hard to find, but if you find these, follow them to the letter, because it's really the first hoop to jump through to prove that you can actually follow instructions. So don't try to be cute or creative. Just if they ask for 200 words, or they say give it to formatted in BLAS, which they used to, really stick to it. Work out who the best editor is to pitch to as well. So sometimes there's a generic editorial email address. If you can find an individual editor's email, and sometimes it's not public, you've got to kind of hunt around, or even I have even guessed at editors' emails based on what their kind of standard email format is, like first name dot last name at wired.com or whatever. Yeah, it's okay to be a bit cheeky and sort of dig up their email address from somewhere and pitch it to them directly. But it's generally, if possible, preferable to send it to a section editor relevant to what you're pitching. And make sure you're pitching a story, not a topic. So a topic is, I want to write about the rural fire service. That's not a story. A story is, I want to write about how there's a fight between council, the rural fire service, and the state government over who owns the rural fire service trucks and equipment. That is a story, which I wrote. So yeah, really think about, it's not just, I want to write about blah. It's like, this is the story that I am pitching to you. So you've got to be really clear about that. Crafting your pitch, start with, the email subject line, freelance pitch, like freelance news pitch, feature pitch, rural fire service stoush over Red Fleet or whatever. I usually do a single sentence intro then. I'm a freelance medical journalist based in Australia. I was wondering if this is an actual pitch. The Lancet's World Report might be interested in a piece about how Australia's had its 6th neonatal death from syphilis. If you've got any kind of scoop, mention it up the top. Exclusivity, if it's time dependent, mention that as high up as possible. And then really what you want to do is sell the story. It's like the back cover blurb for a book. I can't tell you how to write that. You're going to have to look at examples, think about what is the most important couple of paragraphs that's going to tell this editor, tantalize them, entice them into at least asking for more information. The pitch length does depend on the length of the article. I mean, generally, I've done a 500 word pitch for an 800 word news story because it was the first time I'd pitched Scientific American, but I'd done a couple of interviews and everything already because I just really wanted to land it, and it did land. But it generally 2 to 3 pars in terms of the actual blurb is enough. It's also important to mention why now. What's the hook? Like Australia has just banned engineered stone. There's your news hook. Why is it relevant to the publication? That may or may not be important, but particularly if you're writing for a more specialist audience, like retirees, you could say, well, this is important for retirees to know because blah, 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 blah. So again, if you can spell it out and it's important, pop it in there. And then at the bottom, I just usually have a short bio, 1 or 2 sentences, and particularly mention if there's something that qualifies you to write about this subject. For example, I live in a bushfire-prone area that was on fire 2 weeks ago. Do's and don'ts of pitching. Email, don't phone. No one likes speaking at the phone. Put the pitch in the email, not as a Word doc or as an online link. Don't send a fully written article on spec. Unless it's specifically asked for, like the Griffith Review only takes articles on spec, which drives me nuts, but they do. Don't pitch to multiple outlets the same story at the same time. And I know some people do this, but you're really tap dancing on the edge with that, because if multiple ones say yes, you're going to piss off editors, and that's generally not a good thing to do. Avoid sending a pitch on their deadline day or week if it's not a daily. Well, if it's daily, don't send it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If it's a weekly, don't send it on whatever their day is that they're really on crunch time. And don't send it the week, if it's a quarterly, don't send it in the week that they go to print. If you haven't heard for a couple of days or weeks, follow up with another email. I generally give it 2 shots and then I give up. I just think, okay, they're not interested. If it's a time-specific pitch, put that in the email. So if there's an embargo or something, give them a time frame. It's like you can say, this is I'm having this meeting in 2 days' time. Could you please respond by 5 p.m. Tuesday? If I haven't heard from you, I'll assume it's a no. If you've got any audiovisual content worth mentioning, if you've got great pics or video, audio, whatever. If you've got any conflicts of interest, it's important to mention that in a pitch. I mean, I have in the past and more recently done contract writing work for CSIRO. So if I ever pitch a story about CSIRO or that's going to be a CSIRO adjacent, I will mention that in the pitch and leave it up to the editor to decide. It has lost me work. I have had an editor go, yeah, that's too much of a conflict. You can't write about this. And that's fine. You just got to be upfront about it. Rejection. Rejection sucks. Never gets easier. But just know that if an editor takes time out of their day to actually acknowledge and say, no thanks, that's still a step forward. And rejection doesn't kill a story. It just means it's not right for that publication at that time or that editor. So don't waste it. Take the same pitch it to multiple different outlets. Maybe you can take that pitch and pivot it, for a different audience, a different outlet. Never give up on a pitch. You might park it for 5 years, which I have done with stories, but go back to it. Okay, delivering the goods, how to make your editor's life easier. Deliver on deadline. And I hope none of my editors are in this Zoom because they'll know that I don't always do that. So do as I say, not as I do. But if you are struggling, manage their expectations and do it early. Meet the brief. Editors don't want surprises on deadline day with getting a story that's not what they commissioned. So again, if something's changing as you report, check in with your editor early and talk to them. And it's always better to manage that early as possible. Match the publication style. So if I'm writing for a publication for the first time, or even if I write for them regularly, I'll actually go back and look at their stories and just make sure, it's like, do they say says or said? Well, how do they put, percentages or numbers or, professors or doctors or whatever. And if it's a major publication, they might have a style guide, so it's worth asking for it. Stick to the word count. I aim to be at least within 10%. If you're going to go over that, but you want to give the editor a chance to decide what to cut out, you can highlight stuff and say, look, if you want to take this out, you can. Proofread, double check your facts. Now I'm running out of time, but I just really quickly want to get to payment. When to invoice. So my experience is most outlets accept invoices after the work has been published. Some will allow you to invoice once the work has been accepted, which is really important if it's a long lead time. So check with the editor. Check with them about their invoicing requirements. Payment times can vary enormously from the next day to months. I've chased $250 for 6 months. So this is where a buffer comes in. And the last thing I do want to say is it's always a question of how do I set rates? Most of the time in journalism, you don't. They will say, this is what we pay, and you can either take it or leave it. Most outlets have standard rates. Always ask the rate before you commit because sometimes the rates are low, and I've had that happen where it's like, you might be not for profit, but I am not. So, and that's fine. You can try and negotiate it up. If they don't budge, decide whether it's worth your time or not. Really, the wiggle room comes with once you established your interaction with them. But once you have done a few pieces, don't be afraid to ask for an increased word rate. And I say that as someone who's terrible at doing it. But I know of some freelancers in the US who just say every year, it's like, okay, it's time for my word rate increase, which I fully admire the balls it takes to do that. I don't have them, but it's a really important thing to do. And I think I have other stuff, but it's less important, and I probably need to stop and draw breath. So I might, are you happy for me to just go through questions? Did you want to drop in at all, John?
I'm very happy for you to just run the question and answer as you see fit. That should be coming through in the Q&A module for you.
Okay, that's in the chat section, is it?
It is, yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to go from the top. So Gus is asking about conflicts of interest. You're working in climate and nature reporting. Yeah, it's a really tricky one. My experience is like I will avoid, and I have avoided doing content writing work for an agency or for an outlet where an organization where I think, no, I report on you too much. This would actually lose me journalistic work. It depends what your financial priorities are at the moment. But as a general rule, just sort of think like if it's an organization like CSIRO and you're in the science space, that's possibly going to present some conflicts of interest for journalism. So it's really a case of deciding how important it is for you to have either the income from the content work or the journalism work. But if you're ever in doubt when you're pitching a story, if you've got any kind of conflict of interest tie, just say to the editor at the end, just say, by the way, I have done contract writing work for this organization, last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Is that likely to be a problem? You've got to leave it up to them. It's always best to be upfront because you've got to think about what happens if they find out and you hadn't told them and it is a problem, and then you've probably burned that contact. Okay, sorry. Freelance works alongside social media news. Oh, sorry, they're moving around. How freelance journalism works alongside or with social media news. More freelance opportunities in social media content. I'm probably not the best person to ask because I haven't really done that at all. I mean, I really admire people that do, and I know that there's a lot of great reporting that's now done through Instagram, that's done through what was being done on Twitter, and now maybe moved to Blue Sky. I guess with all of these things, I have to think, well, who's going to pay you? And if somebody's actually paying you to do that kind of reporting, great, that's perfect. Again, I don't have really any experience at all of doing that, so I'm afraid I can't really answer that one, sorry. Okay, do I send an opening scene as a few parts as a feature teaser when I pitch? I did do with, I don't often, but I think that's probably going to work best if it's a real color feature that you're pitching. And I did do it with the one pitch that I still have not found a home for, and I've been hanging on to it for like 7 years. I did interviews for it. I pitched the New Yorker. I pitched International, and it was very much a scene setting pitch because it required so many visual, like it was such a visual story. Maybe that's why it didn't get over the line. I don't know, but I think, again, it depends on the outlets. If you are pitching the kind of outlet that's going to run, like Harper's or something, or the Monthly, or that's going to run a big feature, a pitch is your opportunity to sell your writing as well. So how you write that pitch is going to tell the editor how you write that feature. So, and when I say don't think too hard about pitches, it does depend on the pitch. If you're pitching for a big, 5,000 word feature, really that pitch has to be perfect. It has to be the best possible sell for what it is that you want to write. For stories you're really passionate about, how much reporting do you do before you pitch to figure out the angle? I generally haven't done a huge amount of reporting. Again, there are exceptions, like the story that I still haven't found a home for, which I did 4 international interviews for. But I only pitch something if I know enough about it to know that there's a good story there. And it also depends on the editor. Like I have pitched stories that have fallen over. It's pretty rare though. So generally, yeah, I think you need to know enough to know that there's a story and that you can land that story. That if there's any kind of, if it's a story that hinges on an interview with one person, you need to know that one person is available and that they will talk to you. So I have not done an interview with someone, but I have emailed them and say, hey, look, I heard you talk about this at this conference. I'd really like to pitch a story. Would you be happy to talk about this on the record? So it's good to at least make sure that you've got that, because it can be a bit embarrassing if you pitch and they say, yeah, that's a great story. And then you go, shit, sorry, they won't talk to me. I can't do it. Okay, so where are we? So if you're pitching to a second organization, sorry, I should close that window and I can see better. So pitching to a second organization after a first one has accepted your story and run it, do you need to disclose that? Yeah, good question. And that has happened to me recently, where I pitched to one organization, to one outlet, and then they said yes. And then the next morning, another outlet, both international, got in touch and said, hey, we saw that this has happened. We're really interested in you doing a story. And I just disclosed to both of them that I was reporting on it for another outlet at the same time. Was that a problem? One was in the US and one was in the UK. And they like, no, that's fine. So yeah, just say, look, I'm writing this up for this outlet. It's just, I think as a general, just be as honest as possible. It's always a better course of action. What is my acceptance to rejection ratio for pitches? When I was tracking my pitches, I had about a 25% yes rate. So 1 in 4 pitches would get over the line. I did have this miraculous day where I pitched 4 stories to 4 different outlets and all 4 of them got up. It was funny enough, which was an election day. It was the day Tony Abbott got rolled. I can't remember. It was a political day and it had nothing to do with that, but generally about 25% success rate. How many pitches do you have to send to get a yes? Well, yeah, I guess 4, and then you get 1. In terms of how you increase your yes rate, I don't know. If I knew that, I probably would be having a lot more pitches that were landing. I think so much of pitching is just luck. I mean, you've got to have the right story. That's a given, a good story. But sometimes it's just, is the editor having a shitty day? Is it, it can be any number of things. There is a whole lot of luck. Okay, some other questions. How do you manage things when you do get sick? Oh, it's the worst. I very rarely stop work for being sick. The exception was last year when I got pneumonia and I had a temperature of 39.8 and I couldn't type. My hands froze. I literally couldn't type. And that's about the only time that I can think of in pretty much 20 years that I've actually had to email editors and go, I cannot file this. I'm so sick. I have filed from bed so many times. I have filed from hospital for when my kids had broken something. Yeah, see, it sucks. You generally kind of have to work through it, or not have to work through it. I'm very bad at, I hate letting people down, so I generally will almost kill myself to get a story in rather than let an editor down. So I probably could actually be more honest and go, look, I'm feeling like absolute shit. Can I have more time, or I can't file this? But it's pretty rare. How do I track submissions or ideas? I just use Excel. Sorry. I do actually know, I use Trello for mapping my workflow, like all of the stuff that I've got going. My ideas are in Excel, and I also have a huge whiteboard, which is my list of things to do today, things to do this week. I have lists of lists. I like lists. And practicalities of getting paid by overseas publications. Yeah, it's actually pretty easy. So banks have what's called a Swift BIC, a Swift/BIC code, which is basically the international address for your bank. So when you send your invoice, you just got to include, your bank details, bank address, and whatever the Swift BIC or IBAN. There's different words, but contact your bank, or your bank will have it on their website somewhere. It's generally pretty straightforward these days. I haven't had any issues with getting paid from overseas. The copyright organisation is called Copyright Australia Limited. Copyright RIGHT, so CAL. Sorry, Copyright Agency Limited. Isentia always takes my stuff. How do I get them to pay? I'm not sure what Isentia is. It's like a content agency or something. If someone is ripping you off, tell the person that originally paid you to write it. Sick them on them. I did that with my Atlantic story, because then the Daily Terror ripped it off mercilessly. And so I said to the Atlantic, hey, look what they've done. I don't think they did anything with it, but that was kind of good. Music writers, any tips for what you see are gaps in the market? Look, I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that. I mean, my experience, obviously, writing in science, health, and environment is that it is a really good niche to be in. It works for me, and also I love science, so that works really well. I actually don't know what niche areas would be. I think it's a case of you've got to write what you're interested in. It doesn't matter is there a market. It's like saying, is there a market for this book? It's like, write the book. If you build it, they will come, which is a bit flippant, but I think you have to write about what you're passionate about. Otherwise, what are you even doing? And I think, are there any questions that I've missed, John? I think I've tried to.
I think you've gotten to as many as we could hope to get to the time that we have.
Talking at warp speed.
And look, we will send around a survey at the conclusion of today's webinar. And if there's any other questions that are outstanding, or any other questions that come to mind, we can pass them across to Bianca, and she'll be able to answer them to the best of her ability.
And please find me online. My email is just bianca@biancanogrady.com. And if there's a question that I haven't got to, or something you want to ask, do feel free to get in touch. It might take some time to get back to you, but I will get back to you.
Great. I'll pop myself back on screen so I could say goodbye to you all. Look, so we have gone a little bit over time. That was just simply because there were so many questions coming through. And as I mentioned, you'll be able to get a few more questions, an opportunity to ask a few more questions of Bianca. But look, that's it for now. I wish we could go on for another hour or two. Thanks so much, Bianca. That was a really practical session, and I'm sure there's a lot there for people to take away and to apply. And thanks to everyone who joined us today and for the questions that came through thick and fast, as we said. Now, before we close, you will notice that there is a short feedback survey on the screen. I'd be really grateful if you could complete that. It will help us understand what was useful, what else you need, and how we keep improving these sessions, because we are planning more. And I have also been badgering you via email. We're currently running a national training requirements survey for journalists and media workers across Australia. So that is designed to help us better understand your professional development needs, your interests, your barriers facing the sector, and to shape future Walkley training programs. And we'll share that link post the webinar in a follow-up email as well. So once more, thanks again to everyone for being part of today's webinar. We hope it's given you some practical ideas and a bit more confidence about making freelance work for you and to be sustainable. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Bianca, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Good luck.